Hi, I'm Scott Beaulier, Director of the Johnson Center for Political Economy here at Troy University and host of EconVersations. Our center is committed to economic freedom and emphasizes the role capitalism plays in promoting prosperity and improving human lives. On tonight's show, we're going to be looking at one of the key contributors to the growth of government, earmarks, and the practice of earmarking different revenue sources and then linking expenditures to those revenue sources. We have a colleague from our center, George Crowley, on the show tonight, and he's going to talk about some of his research and the findings that he's teased out of that research in terms of the role earmarks are playing on driving government growth. As government grows, we become less free. Larger governments tend to tax more, tend to rely on more monetization of their problems, and make people less free overall. So it's a very big concern of ours in the center to look at the role that government's playing in economic freedom and how we keep government from growing unsustainably large. Dr. Crowley, great to have you on the show again.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's get into this. You have a new policy paper you're working on that deals with earmarking and the effect that it's having on the size of state budgets around the U.S. Let's start and just take it very slowly and talk about what earmarking is for those who aren't familiar with that term.
Right. Well, the process of earmarking tax revenues, which is what we look at in the paper, is it's a budgetary practice where specific taxes, say a tax on cigarettes, are earmarked or dedicated to specific expenditures, say education. So it can be kind of looked at as a constraint on a policymaker that certain tax revenues can only be spent on certain types of expenditures, at least in theory.
Mm-hmm. And I can think of a lot of these that you hear about: tobacco taxes, like you mentioned. Lottery, I guess, would be an example of an earmark. A lot of states have lotteries, yes, and then the funds from the lottery go to a particular source. Is this a prevalent budgetary practice of earmarking?
Yes, it had been more prevalent in the past. Currently, every single state earmarks a portion of its tax revenues. The average is roughly 24% of all tax revenues are earmarked when you look at all states. But there's a range in there. I think Rhode Island earmarks roughly 4, maybe 8% of their tax revenues. And Alabama leads the way and earmarks 84% of all tax revenues to specific expenditure programs.
What are some of those big expenditure programs then for Alabama? They earmark some source of revenue for education. They have the Education Trust Fund.
Right. Alabama has a dedicated fund to education, and then when you look across states, the big three, if you will, targets of dedicated revenues or earmarks are highways, education, and then local governments, so county or city, town kind of governments.
Now, you hear people say that earmarking actually is something that makes a lot of sense, because what you're doing is you're basically applying a user fee to people who use a particular public good, and then you're charging them for it indirectly. You're not necessarily charging a person for using the road, but what you're doing is charging them through the use of gasoline. So like a gasoline tax would be an earmark that then supports the roads. Is there some logic in the earmarks, like trying to link them to, trying to link the expenditure to use? And
yeah.
Does that make sense? Is that like a good earmark?
Absolutely. I mean, that's one of the major cases that's made to support the practice. Gasoline taxes are across the board in every state earmarked towards roads, and they're earmarked 97 to 100% of those revenues go towards road projects. And it's exactly for this logic that you mentioned, that public goods, if you've had any economics, public goods, the major problem is that people will not pay for these things because you can use them once they've been provided for free. So we need to find a way to kind of get people to pay for it, so a gasoline tax may be a way to do that. A problem with this is that a gasoline tax does not fully encompass all of those benefits. There are people that purchase gasoline for use in farm equipment that are not using roads, and then there are people that use roads for bicycles or walking pets and are not actually consuming gasoline. So probably a better direct user fee would be something like a toll. Benefit of using a gasoline tax instead is that it's much easier to kind of collect.
And it seems like that might be the best example is gasoline taxes for roads. You get farther away from the link between use and then expenditure when you look at things like education. They're not
Right.
taxing people for the use of schools.
Right.
If you look at some of the taxes applied to oil rigs in the Gulf, I'm assuming that the revenues drawn from oil drilling don't go into like some kind of environmental fund necessarily. They just go into some other pot that
Yeah, I can't speak to those
Yeah.
taxes in particular because I don't know that. But the education taxes for sure. Education is another one of these public goods. Generally, the argument goes that people underestimate the benefits to society, so we would not provide enough of it on our own, or not demand enough of it on our own. So what states have gone and done, though, is they earmark things like Alabama earmarks beer taxes to education. So if you kind of contrast that with our gasoline to roads, where there was a pretty obvious linkage between those two things. In order to make that same argument for a beer tax to education, you'd have to make some kind of case that people that consume beer derive more of a benefit from education than others, or that students are drinking beer, something like this that is a lot more problematic. So I think that's kind of the thing that got us interested in this project in the first place, was that kind of contrast between things like a beer tax to education or an income tax to local government versus something that you can actually make that kind of user fee case, like a gasoline tax to roads.
I can remember when I used to live in Georgia, the Hope Scholarship for education was funded by the lottery, and most of the people playing the lottery, about 1/3 of people don't play the lottery at all. 1/3 play it only when the winnings get really big, and then 1/3 play it all the time, just habitually. They get their paycheck and go buy a whole bunch of tickets. And the evidence of those playing the lottery, or the demographic of those playing the lottery, was one that most of them weren't seeking higher education, and most of their children were not going on to get higher education. So the idea that you're taxing people a little bit for their lottery usage so that they can then pay for their kids to go to school is just totally off. In fact, it was a rare case of redistribution from the poor to the middle class.
Absolutely.
So
I mean,
no fee or anything attached to it, really.
Right. I mean, the lottery revenues being earmarked is one of these, like you mentioned, rare cases where we can actually kind of point to something being a regressive tax, and it's completely breaks the link of any kind of user fee type thing. And in fact, as you said, you get this redistribution that's kind of on its head from what we usually think about as income redistribution.
Right. Let's get into your the main thesis of your paper, which is that earmarking can actually lead to a growth in government size. What's the mechanism there? I'm imagining earmarking just taking power and control and discretion away from officials, because here's a pot of money that has to go to education, here's a pot of money that has to go to roads, here's a pot that goes to judges or something. And that seems like it would tie their hands, but your research says actually earmarking just allows government to get bigger.
Right, so that's the theory behind why, or at least one of the competing theories about why an earmark is a good kind of constraint on policymakers, that it forces them to spend money in this way. Our research has kind of gone a different way and shown that you can actually use these earmarks, especially those tied to politically popular programs like education, and use them to kind of mask increases in government size. And to get to the kind of the mechanism that's driving it, I have to kind of get into something, so you'll have to bear with me for a moment. But what's driving this is this idea in economics called fungibility. And the idea that if something is fungible, it essentially is a perfect substitute. All right, so the kind of classic example as to why, or that economists use, is food stamps. So if you can imagine somebody going to the grocery store and spending $50 on food, and then going next door to the liquor store and spending $50 on beer. All right, and then so they spend $100 and they spend 50-50 on beer and food. Well, let's say that instead we give them $50 for food stamps that can only be used on food. Presumably, your intuition might tell you, well, now they have $50 additional to spend on food. But if you think about it this way, you go to the grocery store, you take out your $50 of food stamps, you buy your $50 of food. And then you take a step next door to the liquor store, you open up your wallet and you say, wow, food stamps are great, I have $100 to spend on beer now. So the idea here that you can take money and dedicate it to a specific use, I'm not making the claim that anybody's doing anything fuzzy here. They're using money and they're spending it on the dedicated use. Yep. It's just freeing additional resources to be used elsewhere. So if you take that and you kind of amplify it up to the government level, if we take money and we say we're spending $100 on education, and then we earmark some tobacco tax to education and it raises an additional $50, you might think, well, now we have $150 to spend on education. Well, presumably you could do that and you'd see a full dollar for dollar increase in spending on education. What our research shows, and we'll get into this, is the idea that actually what's happening is you're taking that $50, you're putting it towards education. Again, nothing fuzzy. It's actually being used for its dedicated purpose. But it frees this $50 then back into the general fund to be spent elsewhere. So you actually end up seeing this increase in total government size or spending on other programs as opposed to its dedicated purpose.
That makes good sense to me, and you can think about it even, I like your example, you can think about it even like at an individual level. If you pick up some outside income, I do some consulting, make some extra money, and I like to think that all of my consulting money will just go towards my children's education at some point. But now I have this pot of money that's covering their education, and what it leads me to do with my other amounts of money is not focus on education with them and crank up spending on other things. It's very concrete, and fungibility is something that isn't unique to government in terms of being able to reallocate money elsewhere.
Yeah, I mean, it's you can kind of equate it to, if you want to think about it at the individual level, that you get a $20 bill from something, you put it in your wallet with a bunch of other $20 bills, and you say, I'm going to use that $20 bill to buy some DVDs or something. You go, you open up your wallet, well, there's a whole bunch of money in there. You don't know which specific thing. I mean, if it's a perfect substitute like that, then this fungibility issue really kind of makes this whole earmarking process fairly meaningless, at least on at least what theory would predict.
Now, why can't you just put lock boxes on the earmarked funds, or prevent? I guess they're not specifically taking money out of the earmarked revenue sources then. It's just that there's more money freed up for other uses. Or do they sometimes raid the earmarked revenue sources too?
I can't speak to whether that actually ever happens, or and I'm sure every state varies on whether what you can do with, say, surplus revenues or something like that. But the case we're trying to make, and our case doesn't even depend on them actually raiding earmarked funds. We're saying that given that you would spend some general fund revenue in addition to earmarked funds, that you can take those earmarked funds, actually spend them. Again, remember, the person who gets the food stamps is not spending the $50 food stamps on anything other than food.
Yep.
It frees up money that they would have otherwise spent to go to other places. So the earmarked funds may very well be being spent where they're supposed to be being spent. And I would happily assume that they are. The case we're trying to make is that frees those monies that otherwise would have been spent there anyway to be used elsewhere.
You bring up another term in public economics that's used in this literature called stickiness. And can you talk a little bit about the effect earmarking has on funds sticking with the source that they're earmarked to? It seems like they're not really sticking very well, right? You're raising money for an earmarked particular purpose to increase educational quality, and all you're getting is about the same level of spending on educational quality then. Right.
So the idea of stickiness, it comes from this. There's a phenomenon that we kind of call the flypaper effect, and it goes to this discussion we're already having, that if you dedicate money to a certain expenditure, in theory it should have no effect because it's just fungible. That said, there is some evidence that certain funds do stick. And that's what we kind of call this flypaper effect. It's kind of this bizarre phenomenon because it's completely contrary to economic theory. As far as our research with the earmarks or the earmarked tax revenues, we do find that certain revenues do actually stick. And we define stick as essentially you see this dollar for dollar increase. If the best example is gasoline taxes to roads. If I raise one additional earmarked dollar of gasoline taxes, we do see in the data that does lead to roughly a $1 increase in spending on roads. So with those kind of direct linkage, you do see that there's more stickiness. A case where we completely do not see any stickiness whatsoever is the number of states earmark a portion of their just general sales tax revenues to education. So general sales tax, the tax we pay on basically everything. Certain states take that, a percentage of it, say 30%, and dedicate it to education expenditures. We see in our data that that has absolutely no effect on education spending. And in fact, what it does, as theory would probably predict, it actually increases total spending as if it was out of the general fund.
Yeah, back to the food stamp thing, essentially.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about how important earmarking is in driving growth in government. You know, there are many theories about why government has gotten big. Some of them have to do with like voter ideology and just changes in attitudes about government size. Others have to do with, you know, just the nature of politics, redistributing and concentrating benefits on some people and then redistributing income around. So it's basically, we have a transfer society. How does this earmarking research you're doing fit in terms of like a causal story of government getting much bigger? Is it one of the real big drivers, or is it kind of a marginal?
I wouldn't necessarily say it's one of the major drivers of growth. I think it's extraordinarily important, though, and it's becoming increasingly important. States have, through time, decreased the amount of revenues they're earmarking. But I think that that's likely to change going forward for a couple major reasons. The first of which is that states are desperate for cash at the moment. The majority of states are in serious revenue trouble. So you occasionally see calls for, actually in Alabama, we have a recent call for a tax on cigarettes that would be earmarked for education. And you see these kind of calls for the fairly low-hanging fruit type taxes, where if we just put a special tax on a certain group of people who consume cigarettes, and then we earmark it for a certain other group of people, then that'll solve our problems. So I think that's going to be the case. And then also you are seeing these increased calls for kind of constraints on spending. And to the extent that earmarking is still popularly believed to be a good constraint, you will probably see calls for, well, no, we need to take power out of the hands of the policymakers and put it into these specific rules that say you have to spend this on that. So while I don't think it's probably been, like through history, a major driver of growth, it's certainly been a contributing factor. I think it probably will become more important as we go forward.
You may not know this, and this extends beyond what you're doing in your paper, but where does earmarking really come from in the history of its development as a practice? Is it a reaction to just politicians spending willy-nilly on whatever they want and an attempt to constrain them then?
I believe that historically, and I'd have to go back and double check this, but I believe historically it started with earmarking things like property taxes to education, which is another thing where it's a little harder to make the linkage, but it is at least, there is a case you can make there that people live in an area and they demand the education services. And then from there, the major kind of justifications for earmarking are things like, well, we're going to dedicate a certain amount of revenue so that way we know there will always be money for education, or we know there will always be money for roads. So my guess is that is probably the logic that has driven a lot of these things to get passed, the idea to constrain politicians, but also probably more so to the idea that we will always have a pot of money that they can't touch. And to some extent that's probably justified.
So you're concerned about earmarking and the effect it's having on government growth, and your research calls for an end to the practice and cleaning up of the way that we're allocating revenue. What would be a more simple way of improving budgetary practices? Do you have an alternative in mind, or is it more just looking at this isn't working at keeping down spending?
Generally, I'm always in favor of lower taxes with broader bases. So as idyllic as like a tax on actual just consumption would be, a sales tax is probably the best we've got. A lower sales tax that was broader base, covered everything, would be probably a better alternative to these selective and overlapping taxes where you go to the store and you buy a case of beer, or you buy some cigarettes or whatever, you pay your sales tax, but then there are all these additional taxes levied on top of it that are just pure distortionary. They're very popular to pass because these are things that we see as bad as society and we're taxing those people or something like this. But in general, I will always support lower tax rates that have broader bases to these more selective and sin taxes or anything of that sort.
So help me and our viewers understand how that might work. Then you have a lower tax that's a broad base, maybe a consumption tax of like 5 or 6%, and you eliminate a lot of the earmarked taxes. Maybe it's even higher than that. Who knows? All of that money just goes into the general fund then, and different departments need to ask for money and try to get their budgets approved based on some kind of selection process, as opposed to the education fund having these funds committed to it. It'd be more of a competitive effort to gather resources.
Right, in theory. And what I should also make clear is that I'm also a very staunch advocate of tax and expenditure limits on policymakers. So the ideal scenario would be there would be some strict expenditure limit above which the policymakers wouldn't have the discretion to go. And then under that, competing agencies would have to lobby for those strictly reduced funds. And you wouldn't have these ideas where presumably a certain agency is guaranteed some pot of money regardless of how efficient or inefficient it's been. You would actually have to make the case that your group required additional funding. If it all was in some pot and left to that process, I think that would probably be preferred to the situation we have now, where certain entities are just guaranteed revenues out of different tax streams.
Yeah, I remember doing some work a few years ago that looked at expenditure limits and the effect that they had in keeping budgets stable in like Colorado, which was one of the first to do this. And Colorado linked its expenditures to population growth and the rate of inflation. And so you didn't have these wild swings, whereas in Georgia there weren't expenditure limits. So one year you got a 20% increase in the state expenditures, and then the economy tanked the next year and you had this huge fall.
Right.
That's really difficult for just ordinary folks to predict and anticipate. And from a budgetary planning standpoint, it's just disastrous, because you're handing out things to people one year and then you're prorating and doing all kinds of crazy things the next year. So that idea makes real good sense to me.
Right, and if you couple it with the idea that a lot of these places that have expenditure limits that are somehow tied to income, or places that just do not have expenditure limits, you get these essentially counter-cyclical type things where there's a huge downfall in tax revenues. And this is essentially what's going on in a large number of states at the moment. You see this downfall in tax revenues, and states at the same time are seeing people have tough times, so people are asking for more services. And states are faced with either debt problems or having to cut services that are in all likelihood more necessary during these economic downturns.
Right. I'm curious, and I don't know if you looked at this at all, but you said, was it Rhode Island, or there was a state that only earmarks about 4%, and then Alabama's at 84%. Are those states that aren't doing a lot of earmarking constraining the size of state government a little bit more than the ones that are doing a lot of earmarking?
That's not something I would look. I've looked at specifically in this paper. That is a project that we are going to pursue going forward. My hunch would be, I don't know what my hunch would be actually. That's something that we're definitely going to look forward to, because there is a wide gap there between the Alabamas of the world and then the Rhode Islands, where you've got 84 to 4% or so of revenues earmarked.
When you talk about reform, it sure seems like we're a long ways from what would be the ideal broad base. Don't distort things like alcohol and cigarettes, and don't constantly tweak and affect people's behavior through the tax code again and again and again. It's just every session there's new tax incentives being rolled out. There are business breaks if you're a large enough business, but if you don't have enough employees, then you don't get the break. It seems like the ideal that you're imagining is just so far off from where we are in terms of actual policy. Is there any way to get from here where we are to there where you imagine just a fairer tax code?
Presumably the only way that it will actually be viable, at least in my mind, we would need, certainly in Alabama, but elsewhere, it has to be a constitutional thing. And constitutional change is hard, and it takes a very, very long time. But I think that these would be changes that would need to be explicitly not saying put the tax code in the Constitution, because that's probably a bad idea for some reasons, but an explicit clause in a Constitution that says, you can't pass any sort of differences in taxes that favor certain groups over others, which is what all of these different handouts and then on the flip side, these predatory taxes, frankly, on certain groups that consume certain products are these, they're favoring certain groups at the cost of others. So it needs to be a constitutional thing. I don't think it would be something that can readily be changed by virtue of it being a constitutional thing. It almost necessarily has to be a long process. So I think it's the direction we certainly need to go. Last time I was on here, I said I was pessimistic about looking forward, but at the same time, my pessimism gives me optimism because something has to change. People are obviously angry, and states are really kind of coming up against it as far as budgetary problems. So I think that as bad as stuff is getting, it's probably going to force some of these tough changes.
Yeah, it's a mess, and I think that you're right that budgetary realities can often present shocks and new opportunities in terms of the way forward for legislation, and we'll see what happens. We only have a minute left. I'm just curious. You just wrapped up a semester too, teaching Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged in a Morality of Capitalism class. How'd your students respond to that?
They seem to really enjoy it. Yeah. It's a book that I refer to as disturbingly prophetic because it is if you haven't read it, I recommend you read it. But it's extraordinarily relevant even today, and they seem to actually really respond to it well. And we didn't just read Rand. We brought in a lot of the more classic thinkers in morality, and then also in just capitalist thought in general. And it was a great time. I really enjoyed it. Yeah,
she certainly understands distortions in her big book too.
Absolutely.
You play with the thing here, and it has all kinds of ripple effects elsewhere.
Absolutely.
So. I think she would understand and appreciate your work on earmarking if she were around. Well, thank you for joining us tonight, and have a great summer as well. And thank you, viewers, for tuning in. Good night.